Happy Tuesday. Happy Tuesday. It is Tuesday. Whew. Losing track of my days here. I'm gonna just jump in with reading because I have a lot to read today. There's not like a good chapter break anywhere in these because we're getting into the action. So let's go to the burrow. I'm on page 51, chapter 5, Weasley's Wizard Wheezes. And pardon me if I stumble over some of the alliteration in this chapter. Harry spun faster and faster, elbows tucked tightly to his sides, blurred fireplaces flashing past him until he started to feel sick and closed his eyes. Then, when at last he felt himself slowing down, he threw out his hands and came to a halt in time to prevent himself from falling face forward out of the Weasleys' kitchen fire. "Did he eat it?" said Fred excitedly, holding out a hand to pull Harry to his feet. "Yeah," said Harry, straightening up. "What was it?" "Tun-tung toffee," said Fred brightly. "George and I invented them, and we've been looking for someone to test them on all summer." The tiny kitchen exploded with laughter. Harry looked around and saw that Ron and George were sitting at the scrubbed wooden table with two red-haired people Harry had never seen before, though he knew immediately who they must be. Bill and Charlie, the two eldest Weasley brothers. "How are you doing, Harry?" said the nearer of the two, grinning at him and holding out a large hand, which Harry shook, feeling calluses and blisters under his fingers. This had to be Charlie, who worked with dragons in Romania. Charlie was built like the twins, shorter and stockier than Percy and Ron, who were both long and lanky. He had a broad, good-natured face, which was weather-beaten and so freckly that he looked almost tanned. His arms were muscular, and one of them had a large, shiny burn on it. Bill got to his feet, smiling, and also shook Harry's hand. Bill came as something of a surprise. Harry knew that he worked for the Wizarding Bank, Gringotts, and that Bill had been head boy at Hogwarts. Harry had always imagined Bill to be an older version of Percy, fussy about rule-breaking and fond of bossing everyone around. However, Bill was, and there was no other word for it, cool. He was tall, with long hair that he had tied back in a ponytail. He was wearing an earring with what looked like a fang dangling from it. Bill's clothes would not have looked out of place at a rock concert, except that Harry recognized his boots to be made, not of leather, but of dragon hide. Before any of them could say anything else, there was a faint popping noise, and Mr. Weasley appeared out of thin air at George's shoulder. He was looking angrier than Harry had ever seen him. "That wasn't funny, Fred!" he shouted. "What on earth did you give that Muggle boy?" "I didn't give him anything," said Fred with another evil grin. Oh, sorry, hold on a second. I forgot I was still logged on to live chat. You want a live chat with your librarian friends? There we go. Okay. Sorry about that. "I didn't give him anything," said Fred with another evil grin. "I just dropped it. It was his fault he went and ate it. I never told him to." "You dropped it on purpose," roared Mr. Weasley. "You knew he'd eat it. You knew he was on a diet." "How big did his tongue get?" George asked eagerly. "It was 4 feet long before his parents would let me shrink it." Harry and the Weasleys roared with laughter again. "It isn't funny," Mr. Weasley shouted. "That sort of behavior seriously undermines wizard-muggle relations. I spent half my life campaigning against the mistreatment of muggles and my own sons." "We didn't give it to him because he's a muggle," said Fred indignantly. "No, we gave it to him because he's a great bullying git," said George. "Isn't he, Harry?" "Yeah, he is, Mr. Weasley," said Harry earnestly. "That's not the point," raged Mr. Weasley. "You wait until I tell your mother." "Tell me what?" said a voice behind them. Mrs. Weasley had just entered the kitchen. She was a short, plump woman with a very kind face, though her eyes were presently narrowed with suspicion. "Oh, hello, Harry dear," she said, spotting him and smiling. Then her eyes snapped back to her husband. "Tell me what, Arthur?" Mr. Weasley hesitated. Harry could tell that, however angry he was with Fred and George, he hadn't really intended to tell Mrs. Weasley what had happened. There was a silence while Mr. Weasley eyed his wife nervously. Then two girls appeared in the kitchen doorway behind Mrs. Weasley. One, with very bushy brown hair and rather large front teeth, was Harry's and Ron's friend, Hermione Granger. The other, who was small and red-haired, was Ron's younger sister, Ginny. Both of them smiled at Harry, who grinned back, which made Ginny go scarlet. She'd been very taken with Harry ever since his first visit to the burrow. "Tell me what, Arthur?" Mrs. Weasley repeated in a dangerous sort of voice. "It's nothing, Molly," mumbled Mr. Weasley. "Fred and George but I've had words with them." "What have they done this time?" said Mrs. Weasley. "If it's got anything to do with Weasley's Wizard Wheezes." Why don't you show Harry where he's sleeping, Ron? Said Hermione from the doorway. He knows where he's sleeping, said Ron. In my room. He slept there last. We can all go, said Hermione pointedly. Oh, said Ron, cottoning on. Right. Yeah, we'll come too, said George. You stay where you are, snarled Mrs. Weasley. Harry and Ron edged out of the kitchen, and they, Hermione, and Ginny set off along the narrow hallway and up the rickety staircase that zigzagged through the house to the upper stories. What are Weasley's wizard wheezes? Harry asked as they climbed. Ron and Ginny both laughed, although Hermione didn't. Mum found this stack of order forms when she was cleaning Fred and George's room, said Ron quietly. Great long price lists for stuff they've invented. Joke stuff, you know. Fake wands and trick sweets. Loads of stuff. It was brilliant. I never knew they'd been inventing all that. We've been hearing explosions out of their room for ages, but we never thought they were actually making things, said Ginny. We thought they just liked the noise. Only most of the stuff, well, all of it really, was a bit dangerous, said Ron. And you know, they were planning to sell it at Hogwarts to make some money, and Mum went mad at them. Told them they weren't allowed to make any more of it and burned all the order forms. She's furious at them anyway. They didn't get as many OWLs as she expected. OWLs were ordinary wizarding levels, the examinations Hogwarts students took at the age of 15. And then there was this big row, Ginny said, because Mum wants them to go into the Ministry of Magic like Dad, and they told her all they want to do is open a joke shop. Just then, a door on the second landing opened, and a face poked out wearing horn-rimmed glasses and a very annoyed expression. Hi, Percy, said Harry. Oh, hello, Harry, said Percy. I was wondering who was making all the noise. I'm trying to work in here, you know. I've got a report to finish for the office. It's rather difficult to concentrate when people keep thundering up and down the stairs. We're not thundering, said Ron irritably. We're walking. Sorry if we've disturbed the top-secret workings of the Ministry of Magic. What are you working on? Said Harry. A report for the Department of International Magical Cooperation, said Percy smugly. We're trying to standardize cauldron thickness. Some of these foreign imports are just a shade too thin. Leakages have been increasing at a rate of almost 3% a year. That'll change the world, that report will, said Ron. Front page of the Daily Prophet, I expect. Cauldron leaks. Percy went slightly pink. You might sneer, Ron, he said heatedly, but unless some sort of international law is imposed, we might well find the market flooded with flimsy, shallow-bottomed products that seriously endanger. Yeah, all right, said Ron, and he started off upstairs again. Percy slammed his bedroom door shut. As Harry, Hermione, and Ginny followed Ron up 3 more flights of stairs, shouts from the kitchen below echoed up to them. It sounded as though Mr. Weasley had told Mrs. Weasley about the toffees. The room at the top of the house where Ron slept looked much as it had the last time that Harry had come to stay. The same posters of Ron's favorite Quidditch team, the Chudley Cannons, were whirling and waving on the walls and sloping ceiling, and the fish tank on the windowsill, which had previously held frog spawn, now contained one extremely large frog. Ron's old rat, Scabbers, was here no more, but instead there was the tiny gray owl that had delivered Ron's letter to Harry in Privet Drive. It was hopping up and down in a small cage and twittering madly. Shut up, pig, said Ron, edging his way between 2 of the 4 beds that had been squeezed into the room. Fred and George are in here with us because Bill and Charlie are in their room, he told Harry. Percy gets to keep his room all to himself because he's got to work. Why are you calling that owl pig? Harry asked Ron. Because he's being stupid, said Ginny. Its proper name is Pigwidgeon. Yeah, and that's not a stupid name at all, said Ron sarcastically. Ginny named him, he explained to Harry. She reckons it's sweet, and I tried to change it, but it was too late. He won't answer to anything else. So now he's Pig. I've got to keep him up here because he annoys Errol and Hermes. He annoys me too, come to that. Pigwidgeon zoomed happily around his cage, hooting shrilly. Harry knew Ron too well to take him seriously. He had moaned continually about his old rat, Scabbers, but had been most upset when Hermione's cat, Crookshanks, appeared to have eaten him. Where's Crookshanks? Harry asked Hermione now. Out in the garden, I expect, she said. He likes chasing gnomes. He's never seen any before. Percy's enjoying work, then? Said Harry, sitting down on one of the beds and watching the Chudley cannon zooming in and out of the posters on the ceiling. Enjoying it? Said Ron darkly. I don't reckon he'd come home if Dad didn't make him. He's obsessed. Just don't get him onto the subject of his boss. According to Mr. Crouch, as I was saying to Mr. Crouch is of the opinion, Mr. Crouch was telling me, they'll be announcing their engagement any day now. Have you had a good summer, Harry? said Hermione. "Did you get our food parcels and everything?" "Yeah, thanks a lot," said Harry. "They saved my life, those cakes." "And have you heard from—" Ron began. But at a look from Hermione, he fell silent. Harry knew Ron had been about to ask about Sirius. Ron and Hermione had been so deeply involved in helping Sirius escape from the Ministry of Magic that they were almost as concerned about Harry's godfather as he was. However, discussing him in front of Ginny was a bad idea. Nobody but themselves and Professor Dumbledore knew about how Sirius had escaped or believed in his innocence. "I think they've stopped arguing," said Hermione, to cover the awkward moment, because Ginny was looking curiously from Ron to Harry. "Shall we go down and help your mom with dinner?" "Yeah, all right," said Ron. The four of them left Ron's room and went back downstairs to find Mrs. Weasley alone in the kitchen, looking extremely bad-tempered. "We're eating out in the garden," she said when they came in. "There's just not room for 11 people in here. Could you take the plates outside, girls? Bill and Charlie are setting up the tables. Knives and forks, please, you two," she said to Ron and Harry, pointing her wand a little more vigorously than she had intended at a pile of potatoes in the sink, which shot out of their skins so fast that they ricocheted off the walls and ceiling. "Oh, for heaven's sake!" she snapped, now directing her wand at a dustpan, which hopped off the sideboard and started skating across the floor, scooping up the potatoes. "Those two!" she burst out savagely, now pulling pots and pans out of a cupboard, and Harry knew she meant Fred and George. "I don't know what's going to happen to them. I really don't. No ambition, unless you count making as much trouble as they possibly can." Mrs. Weasley slammed a large copper saucepan down on the kitchen table and began to wave her wand around inside it. A creamy sauce poured from the wand tip as she stirred. "It's not as though they haven't got brains," she continued irritably, taking the saucepan over to the stove and lighting it with a further poke of her wand. "But they're wasting them, and unless they pull themselves together soon, they'll be in real trouble. I've had more owls from Hogwarts about them than the rest put together. If they carry on the way they're going, they'll end up in the improper use of magic office." Mrs. Weasley jabbed her wand at the cutlery drawer, which shot open. Harry and Ron both jumped out of the way as several knives soared out of it, flew across the kitchen, and began chopping the potatoes, which had just been tipped back into the sink by the dustpan. "I don't know where we went wrong with them," said Mrs. Weasley, putting down her wand and starting to pull out still more saucepans. "It's been the same for years, one thing after another, and they won't listen to— Oh, not again!" She had picked up her wand from the table, and it had emitted a loud squeak and turned into a giant rubber mouse. "One of their fake wands again!" she shouted. "How many times have I told them not to leave them lying around?" She grabbed her real wand and turned around to find that the sauce on the stove was smoking. "Come on," Ron said hurriedly to Harry, seizing a handful of cutlery from the open drawer. "Let's go and help Bill and Charlie." They left Mrs. Weasley and headed out the back door into the yard. They'd only gone a few paces when Hermione's bandy-legged ginger cat, Crookshanks, came pelting out of the garden, bottle-brush tail held high in the air, chasing what looked like a muddy potato on legs. Harry recognized it instantly as a gnome. Barely 10 inches high, its horny little feet pattered very fast as it sprinted across the yard and dived headlong into one of the Wellington boots that lay scattered around the door. Harry could hear the gnome giggling madly as Crookshanks inserted a paw into the boot, trying to reach it. Meanwhile, a very loud crashing noise was coming from the other side of the house. The source of the commotion was revealed as they entered the garden and saw that Bill and Charlie both had their wands out and were making two battered old tables fly high above the lawn, smashing into each other, each attempting to knock the others out of the air. Fred and George were cheering, Ginny was laughing, and Hermione was hovering near the hedge, apparently torn between amusement and anxiety. Bill's table caught Charlie's with a huge bang and knocked one of its legs off. There was a clatter from overhead, and they all looked up to see Percy's head poking out of a window on the second floor. "Will you keep it down?" he bellowed. "Sorry, Perce," said Bill, grinning. "How are the cauldron bottoms coming on?" "Very badly," said Percy peevishly, and he slammed the window shut. Chuckling, Bill and Charlie directed the table safely onto the grass, end to end, and then with a flick of his wand, Bill reattached the table leg and conjured tablecloths from nowhere. By 7 o'clock, the two tables were groaning under dishes and dishes of Mrs. Weasley's excellent cooking, and the 9 Weasleys, Harry and Hermione, were settling themselves down to eat beneath a clear, deep blue sky. To somebody who had been living on meals of increasingly stale cake all summer, this was paradise. And at first, Harry listened rather than talked as he helped himself to chicken and ham pie, boiled potatoes, and salad. At the far end of the table, Percy was telling his father all about his report on cauldron bottoms. I've told Mr. Crouch that I'll have it ready by Tuesday, Percy was saying pompously. That's a bit sooner than he expected it, but I like to keep on top of things. I think he'll be grateful I've done it in good time. I mean, it's extremely busy in our department just now, what with all the arrangements for the World Cup. We're just not getting the support we need from the Department of Magical Games and Sports. Ludo Bagman. I like Ludo, said Mr. Weasley mildly. He was the one who got us such good tickets for the cup. I did him a bit of a favor. His brother, Otto, got into a spot of trouble. A lawnmower with unnatural powers. I smoothed the whole thing over. Oh, Bagman's likable enough, of course, said Percy dismissively. But how he ever got to be head of department? When I compare him to Mr. Crouch, I can't see Mr. Crouch losing a member of our department and not trying to find out what's happened to them. You realize Bertha Jorkins has been missing for over a month now? Went on holiday to Albania and never came back? Yeah, I was asking Ludo about that, said Mr. Weasley, frowning. He says Bertha's gotten lost plenty of times before now, though I must say, if it was someone in my department, I'd be worried. Oh, Bertha's hopeless, all right, said Percy. I hear she's been shunted from department to department for years, much more trouble than she's worth. But all the same, Bagman ought to be trying to find her. Mr. Crouch has been taking a personal interest. She worked in our department at one time, you know, and I think Mr. Crouch was quite fond of her. But Bagman just keeps laughing and saying she probably misread the map and ended up in Australia instead of Albania. However, Percy heaved an impressive sigh and took a deep swig of elderflower wine. We've got quite enough on our plates at the Department of International Magical Cooperation without trying to find members of other departments too. As you know, we've got another big event to organize right after the World Cup. Percy cleared his throat significantly and looked down toward the end of the table where Harry, Ron, and Hermione were sitting. You know the one I'm talking about, Father. He raised his voice slightly. The top secret one? Ron rolled his eyes and muttered to Harry and Hermione. He's been trying to get us to ask what that event is ever since he started work. Probably an exhibition of thick-bottomed cauldrons. In the middle of the table, Mrs. Weasley was arguing with Bill about his earring, which seemed to be a recent acquisition. With a horrible great fang on it? Really, Bill, what do they say at the bank? Mom, no one at the bank gives a damn how I dress as long as I bring home plenty of treasure, said Bill patiently. And your hair's getting silly, dear, said Mrs. Weasley, fingering her wand lovingly. I wish you'd let me give it a trim. I like it, said Ginny, who was sitting beside Bill. You're so old-fashioned, Mum. Anyway, it's nowhere near as long as Professor Dumbledore's. Next to Mrs. Weasley, Fred, George, and Charlie were all talking spiritedly about the World Cup. It's got to be Ireland, said Charlie thickly, through a mouthful of potato. They flattened Peru in the semifinals. Bulgaria's got Victor Krum, though, said Fred. Krum's one decent player. Ireland has got 7, said Charlie shortly. I wish England had got through. That was embarrassing, that was. What happened? Said Harry eagerly, regretting more than ever his isolation from the wizarding world when he was stuck on Privet Drive. Went down to Transylvania, 390-10, said Charlie gloomily. Shocking performance. And Wales lost to Uganda, and Scotland was slaughtered by Luxembourg. Harry had been on the Gryffindor House Quidditch team ever since his first year at Hogwarts, and owned one of the best racing brooms in the world, a Firebolt. Flying came more naturally to Harry than anything else in the magical world, and he played in the position of Seeker on the Gryffindor House team. Mr. Weasley conjured up candles to light the darkening garden before they had their homemade strawberry ice cream, and by the time they had finished, moths were fluttering low over the table, and the warm air was perfumed with the smell of grass and honeysuckle. Harry was feeling extremely well fed and at peace with the world as he watched several gnomes sprinting through the rose bushes, laughing madly and closely pursued by Crookshanks. Ron looked carefully up the table to check that the rest of the family were all busy talking. Then he said very quietly to Harry, So, have you heard from Sirius lately? Hermione looked around, listened closely. Yeah, said Harry softly, twice. He sounds okay. I wrote to him yesterday. He might write back while I'm here. He suddenly remembered the reason he had written to Sirius, and for a moment he was on the verge of telling Ron and Hermione about his scar hurting again, and about the dream that had awoken him. But he really didn't want to worry them just now, not when he himself was feeling so happy and peaceful. Look at the time, Mrs. Weasley said suddenly, checking her wristwatch. You really should be in bed, the whole lot of you. You'll be up at the crack of dawn to get to the cup. Harry, if you leave your school list out, I'll get your things for you tomorrow in Diagon Alley. I'm getting everyone else's. There might not be time after the World Cup. The match went on for 5 days last time. Wow, hope it does this time, said Harry enthusiastically. Well, I certainly don't, said Percy sanctimoniously. I shudder to think what the state of my in tray would be if I was away from work for 5 days. Yeah, someone might slip dragon dung in it again, eh, Percy? Said Fred. That was a sample of fertilizer from Norway, said Percy, going very red in the face. It was nothing personal. It was, Fred whispered to Harry as they got up from the table. We sent it. Chapter 6. The Portkey. Harry felt as though he had barely lain down to sleep in Ron's room when he was being shaken awake by Mrs. Weasley. Time to go, Harry dear, she whispered, moving away to wake up Ron. Harry felt around for his glasses, put them on, and sat up. It was still dark outside. Ron muttered indistinctly as his mother roused him. At the foot of Harry's mattress, he saw 2 large, disheveled shapes emerging from tangles of blankets. It's time already, said Fred groggily. They dressed in silence, too sleepy to talk. Then, yawning and stretching, the 4 of them headed downstairs into the kitchen. Mrs. Weasley was stirring the contents of a large pot on the stove, while Mr. Weasley was sitting at the table, checking a sheaf of large parchment tickets. He looked up as the boys entered and spread his arms so that they could see his clothes more clearly. He was wearing what appeared to be a golfing sweater and a very old pair of jeans, slightly too big for him and held up with a thick leather belt. What do you think? He asked anxiously. We're supposed to go incognito. Do I look like a muggle, Harry? Yeah, said Harry, smiling. Very good. Where are Bill and Charlie and Percy? Said George, failing to stifle a huge yawn. Well, they're operating, aren't they? Said Mrs. Weasley, heaving the large pot over to the table and starting to ladle porridge into bowls. So they can have a bit of a lie-in. Harry knew that apparating meant disappearing from one place and reappearing almost instantly in another, but had never known any Hogwarts student to do it, and understood that it was very difficult. So they're still in bed? Said Fred grumpily, pulling his bowl of porridge toward him. Why can't we apparate too? Because you're not of age and you haven't passed your test, snapped Mrs. Weasley. And where have those girls got to? She bustled out of the kitchen and they heard her climbing the stairs. You have to pass a test to apparate? Harry asked. Oh yes, said Mr. Weasley, tucking the ticket safely into the back pocket of his jeans. The Department of Magical Transportation had to fine a couple of people the other day for apparating without a license. It's not easy apparition, and when it's not done properly, it can lead to nasty complications. This pair I'm talking about went and splinched themselves. Everyone around the table except Harry winced. Splinched? Said Harry. They left half of themselves behind, said Mr. Weasley, now spooning large amounts of treacle onto his porridge. So of course they were stuck. Couldn't move either way. Had to wait for the accidental magic reversal squad to sort them out. Meant a fair old bit of paperwork, I can tell you, what with the muggles who spotted the body parts they'd left behind. Harry had a sudden vision of a pair of legs and an eyeball lying abandoned on the pavement of Privet Drive. Were they okay? He asked, startled. Oh yes, said Mr. Weasley, matter-of-factly. But they got a heavy fine, and I don't think they'll be trying it again in a hurry. You don't mess around with apparition. There are plenty of adult wizards who don't bother with it. Prefer brooms. Slower, but safer. But Bill and Charlie and Percy can all do it. Charlie had to take the test twice, said Fred, grinning. He failed the first time, apparated 5 miles south of where he meant to, right on top of some poor old dear doing her shopping, remember? Yes, well, he passed the second time, said Mrs. Weasley, marching back into the kitchen and amid hearty snickers. Percy only passed 2 weeks ago, said George. He's been apparating downstairs every morning since, just to prove he can. There were footsteps down the passageway, and Hermione and Ginny came into the kitchen, both looking pale and drowsy. Why do we have to be up so early? Ginny said, rubbing her eyes and sitting down at the table. We've got a bit of a walk, said Mr. Weasley. Walk? Said Harry. What, are we walking to the World Cup? No, that's miles away, said Mr. Weasley, smiling. We only need to walk a short way. It's just that it's very difficult for a large number of wizards to congregate without attracting Muggle attention. We have to be very careful about how we travel at the best of times, and on a huge occasion like the Quidditch World Cup. George! Said Mrs. Weasley sharply, and they all jumped. What? Said George, in an innocent tone that deceived nobody. What is that in your pocket? Nothing. Don't you lie to me. Mrs. Weasley pointed her wand at George's pocket and said, Accio! Several small, brightly colored objects zoomed out of George's pocket. He made a grab for them but missed, and they sped right into Mrs. Weasley's outstretched hand. "We told you to destroy them," said Mrs. Weasley furiously, holding up what were unmistakably more Tun-Tung toffees. Tun-Tung toffees. "We told you to get rid of the lot. Empty your pockets. Go on, both of you." It was an unpleasant scene. The twins had evidently been trying to smuggle as many toffees out of the house as possible, and it was only by using her summoning charm that Mrs. Weasley managed to find them all. "Accio! Accio! Accio!" she shouted, and the toffee zoomed from all sorts of unlikely places, including the lining of George's jacket and the turn-ups of Fred's jeans. "We spent 6 months developing those," Fred shouted at his mother as she threw the toffees away. "Oh, a fine way to spend 6 months, she shrieked. "No wonder you didn't get more OWLs." All in all, the atmosphere was not very friendly as they took their departure. Mrs. Weasley was still glowering as she kissed Mr. Weasley on the cheek, though not nearly as much as the twins, who had each hoisted their rucksacks onto their backs and walked out without a word to her. "Well, have a lovely time," said Mrs. Weasley, "and behave yourselves," she called after the twins' retreating backs, but they did not look back or answer. "I'll send Bill, Charlie, and Percy along around midday," Mrs. Weasley said to Mr. Weasley, as he, Harry, Ron, and Hermione and Ginny set off across the yard after Fred and George. It was chilly and the moon was still out. Only a dull greenish tinge along the horizon to their right showed that daybreak was drawing closer. Harry, having been thinking about thousands of wizards speeding toward the Quidditch World Cup, sped up to walk with Mr. Weasley. "So how does everyone get there without all the muggles noticing?" he asked. "It's been a massive organizational problem," sighed Mr. Weasley. "The trouble is, about 100,000 wizards turn up at the World Cup, and of course, we just haven't got a magical site big enough to accommodate them all. There are places muggles can't penetrate, but imagine trying to pack 100,000 wizards into Diagon Alley or Platform 9 3/4. So we had to find a nice deserted moor and set up as many anti-muggle precautions as possible. The whole ministry's been working on it for months. First, of course, we have to stagger the arrivals. People with cheaper tickets have to arrive 2 weeks beforehand. A limited number use Muggle transport, but we can't have too many clogging up their buses and trains. Remember, wizards are coming from all over the world. Some apparate, of course, but we have to set up safe points for them to appear well away from Muggles. I believe there's a handy wood they're using as the apparition point. For those who don't want to apparate, or can't, we use portkeys. They're objects that are used to transport wizards from one spot to another at a prearranged time. You can do large groups at a time if you need to. There have been 200 portkeys placed at strategic points around Britain, and the nearest one to us is up at the top of Stoatshead Hill, so that's where we're headed. Mr. Weasley pointed ahead of them, where a large black mass rose beyond the village of Ottery St. Catchpole. "What sort of objects are portkeys?" said Harry curiously. "Well, they can be anything," said Mr. Weasley. "Unobtrusive things, obviously, so muggles don't go picking them up and playing with them. Stuff they'll just think is litter." They trudged down the dark, dank lane toward the village, the silence broken only by their footsteps. The sky lightened very slowly as they made their way through the village, its inky blackness diluting to deepest blue. Harry's hands and feet were freezing. Mr. Weasley kept checking his watch. They didn't have breath to spare for talking as they began to climb Stoatshead Hill, stumbling occasionally in hidden rabbit holes, slipping on thick black tuffets of grass. Each breath Harry took was sharp in his chest, and his legs were starting to seize up when, at last, his feet found level ground. "Phew!" panted Mr. Weasley, taking off his glasses and wiping them on his sweater. "Well, we've made good time. We've got 10 minutes. Hermione came over the crest of the hill last, clutching a stitch in her side. "Now we just need the portkey," said Mr. Weasley, replacing his glasses and squinting around at the ground. "It won't be big. Come on." They spread out, searching. They had only been at it for a couple of minutes, however, when a shout rent the still air. "Over here, Arthur! Over here, son! We've got it!" 2 tall figures were silhouetted against the starry sky on the other side of the hilltop. "Amos!" said Mr. Weasley, smiling as he strode over to the man who had shouted. The rest of them followed. Mr. Weasley was shaking hands with a ruddy-faced wizard with a scrubby brown beard who was holding a moldy-looking old boot in his other hand. "This is Amos Diggory, everyone," said Mr. Weasley. "He works for the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures. And I think you know his son, Cedric?" Cedric Diggory was an extremely handsome boy of around 17. He was captain and seeker of the Hufflepuff House Quidditch team at Hogwarts. "Hi," said Cedric, looking around at them all. Everybody said hi back, except Fred and George, who merely nodded. They had never quite forgiven Cedric for beating their team, Gryffindor, in the first Quidditch match of the previous year. "Long walk, Arthur?" Cedric's father asked. "Not too bad," said Mr. Weasley. "We live just on the other side of the village there. You?" "Had to get up at 2, didn't we, Ced? I tell you, I'll be glad when he's got his apparition test. Still, not complaining. Quidditch World Cup. Wouldn't miss it for a sack full of galleons. And the tickets cost about that. Mind you, looks like I got it easy." Amos Diggory peered good-naturedly around at the 3 Weasley boys, Harry, Hermione, and Ginny. "All these yours, Arthur?" "Oh no, only the redheads," said Mr. Weasley, pointing out his children. "This is Hermione, friend of Ron's, and Harry, another friend." "Merlin's beard," said Amos Diggory, his eyes widening. "Harry? Harry Potter?" Yeah, said Harry. Harry was used to people looking curiously at him when they met him, used to the way their eyes moved at once to the lightning scar on his forehead, but it always made him feel uncomfortable. "Ced's talked about you, of course," said Amos Diggory. "Told us all about playing against you last year. I said to him, Ced, that'll be something to tell your grandchildren, that will. You beat Harry Potter." Harry couldn't think of any reply to this, so he remained silent. Fred and George were both scowling again. Cedric looked slightly embarrassed. "Harry fell off his broom, Dad," he muttered. "I told you, it was an accident." "Yes, but you didn't fall off, did you?" roared Amos genially, slapping his son on his back. "Always modest, our Ced. Always the gentleman, but the best man won. I'm sure Harry'd say the same, wouldn't you, eh? One falls off his broom, one stays on. You don't need to be a genius to tell which one's the better flyer." "Must be nearly time," said Mr. Weasley quickly, pulling out his watch again. "Do you know whether we're waiting for any more, Amos?" "No, the Lovegoods have been there for a week already, and the Fawcett's couldn't get tickets," said Mr. Diggory. "There aren't any more of us in this area, are there?" "Not that I know of," said Mr. Weasley. "Yes, it's a minute off. We'd better get ready." He looked around at Harry and Hermione. "You just need to touch the port key, that's all. A finger will do." With difficulty, owing to their bulky backpacks, the 9 of them crowded around the old boot held out by Amos Diggory. They all stood there in a tight circle as a chill breeze swept over the hilltop. Nobody spoke. It suddenly occurred to Harry how odd this would all look if a muggle were to walk up here now. 9 people, 2 of them grown men, clutching this manky old boot in the semi-darkness, waiting. 3, muttered Mr. Weasley, one eye still on his watch. 2, 1. It happened immediately. Harry felt as though a hook just behind his navel had been suddenly jerked irresistibly forward. His feet left the ground. He could feel Ron and Hermione on either side of him, their shoulders banging into his. They were all speeding forward in a howl of wind and swirling color. His forefinger was stuck to the boot as though it was pulling him magnetically onward, and then his feet slammed into the ground. Ron staggered into him and he fell over. The port key hit the ground near his head with a heavy thud. Harry looked up. Mr. Weasley, Mr. Diggory, and Cedric were still standing, though looking very windswept. Everybody else was on the ground. 5:07 from Stoatshead Hill, said a voice. I'm gonna start the next chapter, maybe just another 8 or 9 pages, okay? I feel like reading today. Chapter 7, Bagman and Crouch. Harry disentangled himself from Ron and got to his feet. They'd arrived in what appeared to be a deserted stretch of misty moor. In front of them was a pair of tired and grumpy-looking wizards. One of them was holding a large gold watch, the other a thick roll of parchment and a quill. Both were dressed as muggles, though very inexpertly. The man with the watch wore a tweed suit with thigh-length galoshes, his colleague a kilt and a poncho. "Morning, Basil," said Mr. Weasley, picking up the boot and handing it to the kilted wizard, who threw it into a large box of used port keys beside him. Harry could see an old newspaper, an empty drinks can, and a punctured football. "Hello there, Arthur," said Basil warily. "Not on duty, eh? It's all right for some. We've been here all night. You'd better get out of the way. We've got a big party coming in from the Black Forest at 5:15. Hang on, I'll find your campsite. Weasley. He consulted his parchment list. "About a quarter of a mile's walk over there, first field you come to. Site manager's called Mr. Roberts. Diggory, second field, asked for Mr. Payne." "Thanks, Basil," said Mr. Weasley, and he beckoned everyone to follow him. They set off across the deserted moor, unable to make out much through the mist. After about 20 minutes, a small stone cottage next to a gate swam into view. Beyond it, Harry could just make out the ghostly shapes of hundreds and hundreds of tents, rising up the gentle slope of a large field toward a dark wood on the horizon. They said goodbye to the Diggorys and approached the cottage door. A man was standing in the doorway, looking out at the tents. Harry knew at a glance that this was the only real Muggle for several acres. When he heard their footsteps, he turned his head to look at them. "Morning," said Mr. Weasley brightly. "Morning," said the Muggle. "Would you be Mr. Roberts?" I would," said Mr. Roberts. "And who are you?" "Weasley, 2 tents, booked a couple of days ago." "Aye," said Mr. Roberts, consulting a list tacked to the door. "You've got a space up by the wood there. Just the one night?" "That's it," said Mr. Weasley. "You'll be paying now, then?" said Mr. Roberts. "Ah, right, certainly," said Mr. Weasley. He retreated a short distance from the cottage and beckoned Harry toward him. "Help me, Harry," he muttered, pulling out a roll of Muggle money from his pocket and starting to peel the notes apart. "This one's a 10? Ah, yes, I see the little number on it now. So this is a 5. A 20, Harry corrected him in an undertone, uncomfortably aware of Mr. Roberts trying to catch every word. "Ah, yes, so it is. I don't know, these little bits of paper." "You foreign?" said Mr. Roberts as Mr. Weasley returned with the correct notes. "Foreign?" repeated Mr. Weasley, puzzled. "You're not the first one who's had trouble with money," said Mr. Roberts, scrutinizing Mr. Weasley closely. I had two try and pay me with great gold coins the size of hubcaps 10 minutes ago." "Did you really?" said Mr. Weasley nervously. Mr. Roberts rummaged around in a tin for some change. "Never been this crowded," he said suddenly, looking out over the misty field again. "Hundreds of pre-bookings. People usually just turn up." "Is that right?" said Mr. Weasley, his hand held out for his change, but Mr. Roberts didn't give it to him. "Aye," he said thoughtfully. "People from all over. Loads of foreigners. And not just foreigners. Weirdos, you know. There's a bloke walking around in a kilt and a poncho." "Shouldn't he?" said Mr. Weasley anxiously. "It's like some sort of, I don't know, like some sort of rally," said Mr. Roberts. "They all seem to know each other, like a big party." At that moment, a wizard in +4s appeared out of thin air next to Mr. Roberts' front door. "Obliviate," he said sharply, pointing his wand at Mr. Roberts. Instantly, Mr. Roberts' eyes slid out of focus, his brows unknitted, and a look of dreamy unconcern fell over his face. Harry recognized the symptoms of one who had just had his memory modified. "A map of the campsite for you," said Mr. Roberts placidly to Mr. Weasley, "and your change." "Thanks very much," said Mr. Weasley. The wizard in +4s accompanied them toward the gate to the campsite. He looked exhausted. His chin was blue with stubble, and there were deep purple shadows under his eyes. Once out of earshot of Mr. Roberts, he muttered to Mr. Weasley, "Been having a lot of trouble with him. Needs a memory charm 10 times a day to keep him happy. And Ludo Bagman's not helping. Trotting around talking about bludgers and quaffles at the top of his voice. Not a worry about anti-Muggle security. Blimey, I'll be glad when this is over. See you later, Arthur." He disapparated. "I thought Mr. Bagman was head of magical games and sports," said Ginny, looking surprised. "He should know better than to talk about bludgers near Muggles, shouldn't he?" "He should," said Mr. Weasley, smiling and leading them through the gates into the campsite. "But Ludo's always been a bit, lax about security. You couldn't wish for a more enthusiastic head of the sports department, though. He played Quidditch for England himself, you know. He was the best beater the Wimborne Wasps ever had." They trudged up the misty field between long rows of tents. Most looked almost ordinary. Their owners had clearly tried to make them as Muggle-like as possible, but had slipped up by adding chimneys or bell pulls or weather vanes. However, here and there was a tent so obviously magical that Harry could hardly be surprised that Mr. Roberts was getting suspicious. Halfway up the field stood an extravagant confection of striped silk, like a miniature palace, with several live peacocks tethered at the entrance. A little farther on, they passed a tent that had 3 floors and several turrets, and a short way beyond that was a tent that had a front garden attached, complete with bird bath, sundial, and fountain. "Always the same," said Mr. Weasley, smiling. "We can't resist showing off when we get together. Ah, here we are. Look, this is us." They'd reached the very edge of the wood at the top of the field, and there was an empty space with a small sign hammered into the ground that read, WEEZLY, Weasley. "Couldn't have a better spot," said Mr. Weasley happily. "The field is just on the other side of the wood there. We're as close as we could be." He hoisted his backpack from his shoulders. "Right," he said excitedly. "No magic allowed, strictly speaking, not when we're out in these numbers on Muggle land. We'll be putting these tents up by hand. Shouldn't be too difficult. Muggles do it all the time." Here, Harry, where do you reckon we should start? Harry had never been camping in his life. The Dursleys had never taken him on any kind of holiday, preferring to leave him with Mrs. Figg, an old neighbor. However, he and Hermione worked out where most of the poles and pegs should go, and though Mr. Weasley was more of a hindrance than a help, because he got thoroughly overexcited when it came to using the mallet, they finally managed to erect a pair of shabby two-man tents. All of them stood back to admire their handiwork. Nobody looking at these tents would guess they belonged to wizards, Harry thought, but the trouble was that once Bill, Charlie, and Percy arrived, they would be a party of 10. Hermione seemed to have spotted this problem too. She gave Harry a quizzical look as Mr. Weasley dropped to his hands and knees and entered the first tent. "We'll be a bit cramped," he called, "but I think we'll all squeeze in. Come and have a look." Harry bent down, ducked under the tent flap, and felt his jaw drop. He had walked into what looked like an old-fashioned 3-room flat, complete with bathroom and kitchen. Oddly enough, it was furnished in exactly the same sort of style as Mrs. Figg's house. There were crocheted covers on the mismatched chairs and a strong smell of cats. "Well, it's not for long," said Mr. Weasley, mopping his bald patch with a handkerchief and peering in at the 4 bunk beds that stood in the bedroom. "I borrowed this from Perkins at the office. Doesn't camp much anymore, poor fellow. He's got lumbago." He picked up the dusty kettle and peered inside it. "We'll need water. There's a tap marked on the map the Muggle gave us," said Ron, who had followed Harry inside the tent and seemed completely unimpressed by its extraordinary inner proportions. "It's on the other side of the field." "Well, why don't you, Harry, and Hermione go and get us some water then?" said Mr. Weasley, handing over the kettle and a couple of saucepans. "And the rest of us will get some wood for fire." "But we've got an oven," said Ron. "Why can't we just—" "Ron, anti-Muggle security," said Mr. Weasley, his face shining with anticipation. "When real Muggles camp, they cook on fires outdoors. I've seen them at it." After a quick tour of the girls' tent, which was slightly smaller than the boys', though without the smell of cats, Harry, Ron, and Hermione set off across the campsite with the kettle and saucepans. Now, with the sun newly risen and the mist lifting, they could see the city of tents that stretched in every direction. They made their way slowly through the rows, staring eagerly around. It was only just dawning on Harry how many witches and wizards there must be in the world. He'd never really thought much about those in other countries. Their fellow campers were starting to wake up. First to stir were the families with small children. Harry had never seen witches and wizards this young before. A tiny boy, no older than 2, was crouched outside a large pyramid-shaped tent, holding a wand and poking happily at a slug in the grass, which was swelling slowly to the size of a salami. As they drew level with him, his mother came hurrying out of the tent. "How many times, Kevin? You don't touch Daddy's wand. Ugh!" She had trodden on the giant slug, which burst. Her scolding carried after them on the still air, mingling with the little boy's yells. "You bust slug! You bust slug!" A short way farther on, they saw 2 little witches, barely older than Kevin, who were riding toy broomsticks that rose only high enough for the girls' toes to skim the dewy grass. A ministry wizard had already spotted them. As he hurried past Harry, Ron, and Hermione, he muttered distractedly, "In broad daylight, parents having a lie-in, I suppose." Here and there, adult wizards and witches were emerging from their tents, starting to cook breakfast. Some, with furtive looks around them, conjured fires with their wands. Others were striking matches with dubious looks on their faces, as though sure this couldn't work. 3 African wizards sat in serious conversation, all of them wearing long white robes and roasting what looked like a rabbit on a purple fire, while a group of middle-aged American witches sat gossiping happily beneath a spangled banner stretched between their tents that read, "The Salem Witches Institute." Harry caught snatches of conversation in strange languages from the inside of tents they passed, and though he couldn't understand a word, the tone of every single voice was excited. Is it my eyes? Or has everything gone green?" said Ron. It wasn't just Ron's eyes. They had walked into a patch of tents that were all covered with a thick growth of shamrocks, so that it looked as though small, oddly shaped hillocks had sprouted out of the earth. Grinning faces could be seen under those that had their flaps open. Then, from behind them, they heard their names. "Harry! Ron! Hermione!" It was Seamus Finnegan, their fellow Gryffindor 4th year. He was sitting in front of his own shamrock-covered tent with a sandy-haired woman who had to be his mother and his best friend, Dean Thomas, also of Gryffindor. "Like the decorations?" said Seamus, grinning. "The ministry's not too happy." "Ah, why shouldn't we show our colors?" said Mrs. Finnegan. You should see what the Bulgarians have got dangling all over their tents. You'll be supporting Ireland, of course, she added, eyeing Harry and Ron and Hermione beadily. When they had assured her that they were indeed supporting Ireland, they set off again, though, as Ron said, like we'd say anything else surrounded by that law. I wonder what the Bulgarians have got dangling all over their tents, said Hermione. Let's go and have a look, said Harry, pointing to a large patch of tents upfield where the Bulgarian flag, white, green, and red, was fluttering in the breeze. The tents here had not been bedecked with plant life, but each and every one of them had the same poster attached to it, a poster of a very surly face with heavy black eyebrows. The picture was, of course, moving, but all it did was blink and scowl. Crumb, said Ron quietly. What? Said Hermione. Crumb, said Ron. Victor Crumb, the Bulgarian seeker. He looks really grumpy, said Hermione, looking around at the many crumbs, blinking and scowling at them. Really grumpy? Ron raised his eyes to the heavens. Who cares what he looks like? He's unbelievable. He's really young, too. Only just 18 or something. He's a genius. You wait until tonight. You'll see. There was already a small queue for the tap in the corner of the field. Harry, Ron, and Hermione joined it, right behind a pair of men who were having a heated argument. One of them was a very old wizard who was wearing a long, flowery nightgown. The other was clearly a ministry wizard. He was holding out a pair of pinstriped trousers and almost crying with exasperation. Just put them on, Archie. There's a good chap. You can't walk around like that. The muggle at the gate's already getting suspicious. I bought this in a muggle shop, said the old wizard stubbornly. Muggles wear them. Muggle women wear them, Archie, not the men. They wear these, said the ministry wizard, and he brandished the pinstriped trousers. I'm not putting them on, said old Archie in indignation. I like a healthy breeze round my privates, thanks. Hermione was overcome with such a strong fit of the giggles at this point that she had to duck out of the queue and only returned when Archie had collected his water and moved away. Walking more slowly now because of the weight of the water, they made their way back through the campsite. Here and there they saw more familiar faces, other Hogwarts students with their families. Oliver Wood, the captain of Harry's house Quidditch team, who had just left Hogwarts, dragged Harry over to his parents' tent to introduce him and told him excitedly that he had just been signed to the Puddlemere United reserve team. Next, they were hailed by Ernie Macmillan, a Hufflepuff fourth year, and a little farther on they saw Cho Chang, a very pretty girl who played Seeker on the Ravenclaw team. She waved and smiled at Harry, who slopped quite a lot of water down his front as he waved back. More to stop Ron from smirking than anything, Harry hurriedly pointed out a large group of teenagers whom he had never seen before. Who do you reckon they are? He said. They don't go to Hogwarts, do they? Expect they go to some foreign school, said Ron. I know there are others. Never met anyone who went to one, though. Bill had a pen friend at a school in Brazil. This was years and years ago. And he wanted to go on an exchange trip, but Mom and Dad couldn't afford it. His pen friend got all offended when he said he wasn't going and sent him a cursed hat. It made his ears shrivel up. Harry laughed, but didn't voice the amazement he felt at hearing about other wizarding schools. He supposed, now that he saw representatives of so many nationalities in the campsite, that he'd been stupid to never realize that Hogwarts couldn't be the only one. He glanced at Hermione, who looked utterly unsurprised by the information. No doubt she had run across the news about other wizarding schools in some book or other. Okay, I'm going to stop there. I'm on page 85, and come back tomorrow, and we'll read about the Quidditch World Cup. Woohoo! Okay, have a great sunny Tuesday.